She sold the house behind my back. I found out on a Tuesday, standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, clutching a carton of milk and a loaf of bread. A notification buzzed on my phone: escrow closed, 1842 Magnolia Drive. I stared at the screen, numb. That house wasn't just an address. It was the last living piece of my grandmother. And as far as I knew, it still belonged to me. My name is Emma. I'm 31 years old. I don't yell, I don't throw things, and I've never been one for drama. But that day, something in me cracked. Not loud, not visible. Just a small, clean break in a place no one else could see. I left the groceries behind and walked out. Magnolia Drive had always smelled like jasmine in spring. That house, white shutters, ivy creeping up the brick, the creak of the porch swing, was where I learned to braid my grandmother's hair, where I cried after my first heartbreak, where she taught me how to balance a checkbook and how to never, ever let anyone take advantage of me. She left the house to me in her will. It was clear, uncontested, legal. I paid the taxes. I handled the maintenance. I even had a tenant living there, a quiet, older woman named Margie who'd been a friend of my grandmother's since their college days. And now it was gone. Sold. I drove straight there. The for sale sign was gone. So was Margie's car. The garden beds were dug up, the porch furniture removed. Only the magnolia tree remained, its wide arms reaching out like it was waiting to hold someone who never came home. I called my mother. She didn't answer. But she sent a text 5 minutes later. Family meeting tonight. Come alone. No explanation. No apology. I knew where it would be, my parents' house. The same place they used to host Sunday dinners before everything became transactional. The driveway was already full when I pulled in. My mother's Mercedes, my stepfather's SUV, both of my siblings' cars. And 2 unfamiliar sedans. I recognized the logo on the side of one. Legal counsel. I stepped into the house I grew up in and felt it immediately, the shift in temperature. Not the thermostat kind. The emotional kind. The kind where every smile is tight, every chair strategically placed, every word rehearsed. My mother was standing by the fireplace, arms crossed. Her hair was perfect. She always made sure of that. She said, "Emma, meet our lawyers." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't a mistake. This was a siege. And they were ready for war. The older lawyer, gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, handed me a manila envelope. Inside, paperwork. Notarized, filed, finalized. Apparently, while I was working late nights at the clinic and coordinating care for my patients, my mother had somehow gained temporary conservatorship over the estate. Claimed I was emotionally overwhelmed, that I had neglected the property, and had it deemed at risk of depreciation. She sold it for $720,000. Below market. Claimed it was urgent. Claimed it was for family medical expenses. I looked around the room. My brother looked away. My sister picked at her nail polish. My stepfather poured himself a second glass of wine. I said, "This was fraud." My mother smiled. She said, "It's done. There's nothing to fight." But she was wrong. Because what they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to check, was that I'd already filed a title correction claim. Weeks ago, when Margie mentioned someone had come by to photograph the property without notifying her. I didn't accuse anyone then. I just filed the paperwork. I didn't tell a soul. Now, looking at the signatures, the dates, the notary stamps, I saw it. A mistake. A forged initial. Not mine. Their arrogance had left a paper trail. I slipped the documents back into the envelope. Calmly. Without a word. And I walked out the same way I had walked in. Composed. But not the same. Because when someone burns the bridge to your past, they forget you're still holding the blueprint. I drove home and made exactly one phone call. Not to a lawyer. To someone far more dangerous to people like them. My grandmother's accountant. He picked up after the second ring. Still sharp, still loyal. He said, "Emma?" I said, "They sold the house." He was silent for a beat, then said, "Are you ready?" I replied, "I've never been more ready in my life. Because this time I wouldn't be defending what was mine. I'd be reclaiming it. Piece by calculated piece. And this was only the beginning. I always thought losing something meant watching it slip from your hands. But sometimes, it's taken while you're standing still, trusting the people who are supposed to love you. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I even tried. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope open in front of me, the documents spread out like pieces of a machine someone had sabotaged. The pages reeked of confidence. Legal phrasing. Notarized illusions. Terms like liquidation, conservatorship, and asset protection. All of it meant to sound professional, sterile. As if it wasn't personal. But it was personal. The address on those papers wasn't just property. It was the smell of cinnamon bread baking on Saturday mornings. The sound of my grandmother's slippers crossing the hallway. Her voice, steady, calm, reading aloud while I fell asleep in the guest room after my parents fought downstairs. I picked up the forged document again. The signature looked close, but not close enough. Whoever had traced it didn't know the subtle loop I always added at the end. It was a childhood habit. Grandma used to say it made my name look like a ribbon tied around a gift. That ribbon was gone. But the fraud wasn't clean. And I knew the accountant would find more. His name was Bernard Klein. My grandmother had trusted him for over 2 decades, long after her first advisor retired. He was meticulous, dry, almost unreadable in conversation, but lethal in a spreadsheet. When I'd called him, I hadn't expected warmth. I didn't need warmth. I needed someone who would follow the money without flinching. The next morning, he emailed me a folder labeled simply, Activity. Inside, dates, transfers, scanned receipts, and a 2-sentence note. Emma. Preliminary review suggests misappropriation of at least 3 restricted assets. Advise we meet in person. The calmness of it chilled me more than any confrontation could have. I took the rest of the day off work. No explanation to anyone. Just silence and a polite out-of-office reply. I knew I couldn't focus, not while this sat like a live wire beneath my skin. I drove to Bernard's office, an old converted brownstone nestled between 2 law firms downtown. Inside, it still smelled faintly of tobacco and dust-covered legal books. He greeted me with a nod, gestured to the chair across from his, and slid the file toward me. He said, "There are irregularities, Emma." I didn't want to speculate until I confirmed them. I opened the folder. The first page was a copy of my grandmother's amended trust agreement. Signed, sealed, dated 2 months before her final hospital admission. It clearly listed me as sole beneficiary of the house, with language preventing liquidation for 5 years without my express consent. The next few pages showed how that document had been bypassed. Through a temporary power of attorney my mother had obtained, briefly, for emergency medical decisions. It had expired before the sale, but the bank hadn't verified it properly. I said nothing. Just traced the lines on the paper with my finger, like I could undo them if I looked long enough. Bernard added, "They relied on you staying quiet. Or not knowing what to look for." He was right. They'd bet on my silence. On my avoidance of conflict. On the years I'd spent being the agreeable one. The daughter who didn't fight. Who stepped back so the louder voices could fill the room. What they hadn't accounted for was this: I'd been watching. 4 years. Not just observing, but remembering. Every time my mother called me overly sensitive for asking simple questions. Every time she dismissed the way my grandmother chose to include me in her estate discussions. Every time she insisted, "We'll handle it as a family," only to shut me out of the room. I wasn't just angry. I was awake. Bernard provided me with a list of next steps, legal contacts, forensic accountants, potential court orders. He said, "If you want to pursue this, I'll coordinate. But understand, it won't stay quiet. This will go to discovery. Everyone will see everything." I nodded. Because that was the point. That afternoon, I went home and pulled the box out of my closet, the one I hadn't opened since my grandmother's funeral. Inside, letters. Handwritten notes. Her journal. But also receipts, saved statements, and a thick envelope labeled in her handwriting, in case Patricia oversteps. Even from beyond the grave, she knew. I read through it slowly. Every paragraph filled with clarity she never voiced aloud. She'd anticipated the battle, and prepared me without saying so directly. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just opened a blank document and began writing my own affidavit, not to the court, not yet. Just to myself. A record of what had happened, line by line. A story told plainly, without embellishment. Because truth has a shape. And once it starts forming, you can't unsee it. The next morning, I sent a single group email to my mother, my stepfather, and both my siblings. Subject, upcoming proceedings. 5 words. You will be hearing from counsel. I didn't wait for replies. Instead, I packed a small bag and drove 4 hours north, to the lakeside cottage my grandmother used to take me to during summers. It was quiet there. Remote. No cell signal. Just the hush of water brushing against the dock and the steady, metronome rhythm of cicadas at dusk. I stayed 3 days. Didn't speak to anyone. Just walked, breathed, and wrote. And when I returned, my lawyer was waiting. She wasn't theatrical. That's why I chose her. No glossy promises. Just facts, delivered cleanly, like the edge of a blade. She said, "This will escalate." I replied, "Good." But I wasn't chasing drama. I was chasing something else entirely. Something more dangerous to people like my mother. Accountability. And I knew exactly where to begin. I had copies of the keys to every room they tried to lock me out of. And I was going to use them. One door at a time. Until none of them could pretend they didn't hear me coming. They didn't fight me directly. They just made it harder to breathe. My lawyer filed the first motion 2 days after I returned from the lake. It was a simple filing, a temporary injunction to freeze any profits from the sale of the house and an order for full disclosure of documents tied to the estate. Within hours, I knew they'd seen it. The silence became tactical. No angry calls. No panicked emails. Just absence. My mother removed me from the shared family calendar. My brother unfollowed me on every platform. My sister left a voicemail that said nothing of substance, just a vague, "I wish you'd talk to us first." Like I hadn't spent years trying. At work, I stayed quiet. Efficient. Cordial. No one suspected anything. I handled patient reports. Attended meetings. Ate lunch alone, as I often did. But inside, I felt the pressure build. Not panic, something denser. The awareness that once you step out of the role people have assigned to you, they don't just resist. They punish. One by one, I began to lose things I hadn't realized were conditional. My aunt stopped replying to my texts. The cousin I used to babysit blocked me after liking a vague post my mother shared, some quote about greedy hearts hiding behind sad eyes. It didn't name me. But everyone knew. The thing about family isn't the words. It's the patterns. And when you break one, even quietly, they notice. I kept going. My lawyer, Helen, prepared the preliminary hearing brief with the calmness of someone who had seen too many families unravel over money. She didn't ask if I was okay. I respected her for that. She said, "They'll likely accuse you of emotional instability. We need to get ahead of that." I handed her a folder. Inside, clean scans of text threads, calendar logs, voicemails, even dated emails between me and my grandmother, confirming conversations, repairs, holiday visits, small domestic decisions. All documented, all polite. She flipped through the pages. She said, "You've built a better record than most forensic accountants." I replied, "I'm used to not being believed. So I learned to keep receipts." Her mouth turned slightly, not a smile, not pity. Just recognition. That evening, the retaliation shifted. I received a certified letter at my door, a formal request from my stepfather's attorney demanding repayment for previously extended family financial support related to the house's upkeep. They were billing me for a decade of favors they'd never once mentioned. Tree trimming in 2015. A water heater inspection in 2017. My brother's brief stay during the holidays 2 years ago, itemized as emergency lodging. The total came to $38,200. I sat on the floor and read it twice. Then I laughed. Soft. Exhausted. I wasn't surprised. But some part of me still hoped, on some faint level, that one of them might blink. Might pull back before going this far. But they didn't. They'd committed. And now they needed me to break. Helen filed a formal response, and we began collecting witness statements. Margie, the former tenant, agreed to testify. So did Bernard. So did the contractor who'd worked on the roof the summer before the sale and knew I'd signed every check. I had truth on my side. But it felt like a cold kind of justice. The loneliest kind. My phone rang less. My inbox went quiet. Social media filled with family photos I wasn't in, dinners, birthdays, a baby shower I hadn't even heard about. I didn't comment. Didn't react. I just watched. Like a ghost looking in on the life I used to belong to. And then came the email. From my sister. It was long. Rambling. At first it sounded like an apology. She wrote, "None of this is about the house. You know that, right? It's about the way you always make things harder than they need to be." She talked about our childhood. About our mother's sacrifices. About how families have to stick together, even when things aren't fair. She said that dragging this through court was selfish. That grandma would hate this. That I was destroying our family's image. But the line that struck me was this. If you'd just signed the house over when Mom asked, none of this would have happened. There it was. The truth. Not about legality, or misunderstandings, or estate confusion. Just expectation. They had expected me to surrender. And I hadn't. I didn't reply. I archived the email. But something changed in me that night. Not rage. Not even sadness. Just a quiet kind of clarity. The next day, I sent Helen a new list of questions. I wanted to know who had filed the power of attorney paperwork. What notary had stamped it. What account the house proceeds had gone into. I wanted phone records. Text logs. Metadata. She didn't ask why. She simply said, "I'll get started." I didn't leave the house that weekend. Instead, I spread out every legal document across my kitchen table. Made diagrams. Connected timelines. The thing about being underestimated your whole life is that people stop looking closely at you. They assume your silence is ignorance. That your composure is passivity. What they don't see is how silence sharpens you. How composure becomes precision. By Sunday night, I found it. A single bank transaction, a wire transfer out of the holding account from the house sale. It was flagged by the title company as urgent disbursement. But the recipient? Not a medical facility. Not a legal trust. It was a payment to a private consultant in Nevada, one I happened to recognize. He'd handled the refinancing of my stepfather's failed property development project 5 years ago. The money from the house hadn't gone to family needs. It had gone to cover a mistake. A failure my mother had sworn never to speak of again. Now it was on paper. And admissible. I didn't sleep that night. But I didn't need to. Because the storm wasn't just coming anymore. It was already here. And I was ready to walk into the center of it, steady, prepared. Not for revenge. Not for retribution. But for something far more dangerous. Exposure. The deeper I dug, the calmer I became. It's strange, what happens to your fear when it has a job to do. By Monday morning, I had printed everything. The wire transfer details, the timestamped metadata from the title company's server, the email chain between the notary and the broker, all of it stored in a binder with tabs and annotations. I didn't need the binder, not really. But putting it together gave my anxiety a shape. Something I could touch. Helen reviewed it in silence. Then she said, "You're not just prepared. You're surgical." I replied, "They made this surgical. I'm just following the cut." She nodded once and closed the binder. That afternoon, she contacted opposing counsel to inform them we were expanding the complaint to include financial misrepresentation, misuse of fiduciary authority, and post-sale asset redirection. They didn't respond for 2 days. When they finally did, it wasn't a phone call or even an email, it was a new filing. A counterclaim. They were accusing me of harassment, undue influence over my grandmother in her final years, and emotionally destabilizing the family structure. Helen slid the document across her desk. She said, "They're playing dirty now." I expected that. What I didn't expect was how they framed it. My mother's affidavit painted me as manipulative, distant, unstable. My sister described me as withdrawn and controlling, my brother called me emotionally cold. They weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to discredit me personally. I read every word. Then I reread it. And then I sat very still for almost an hour. I didn't cry. I didn't break. But something inside me turned. Not bitter. Not cruel. Just done. I drove home and packed a single suitcase. Not to leave, but to reclaim something I hadn't touched in years, my grandmother's handwritten ledgers. She kept them at the lake house, in the drawer beneath the guest bed. No one had bothered to go back up there since she passed. I wasn't sure if they even remembered the cabin had a safe. I did. Inside were 8 books, each one a year's worth of notes. Expenses, observations, notes about tenants, neighbors, family visits. Everything she didn't trust to digital storage. In the final ledger, there were 2 full pages dedicated to a single entry, Patricia attempting power of attorney again. Emma aware. Left legal contacts in envelope, closet safe. That envelope still existed. I opened it slowly, hand steady. Inside were notarized statements, conversations my grandmother had had with Bernard and another witness, detailing her intent to protect me from future pressure. There were photographs, too, of the house, receipts in my name, even a handwritten note in her final weeks. "She's the only one who sees this house as a home. The rest just see it as equity." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Let it settle into me. I copied the documents. I brought the originals to Helen. She said, "This changes everything." I didn't ask what that meant legally. I already knew what it meant emotionally. It meant my grandmother had seen it coming. All of it. It meant she believed me. That was all I needed. I started preparing differently after that. Not just legally. Strategically. I reviewed deposition strategies. Researched family court precedent. I studied body language patterns in litigation, how people give themselves away. Then I made a list of every person who had benefited from the sale. Not just my mother and stepfather. My brother, who had received a loan around the same time. My sister, who had upgraded her car. Even the attorney who had filed the initial paperwork had recently received a payment from the same Nevada-based account as the consultant. The web was wider than I thought. But that didn't intimidate me. It clarified my aim. I didn't want revenge. I wanted exposure. Because exposure forces change, not just in courts, but in families. Especially the ones that survive on silence. Helen contacted a financial forensic specialist. He said, "We'll trace the assets. Every dollar. If they touched it, we'll find it." I replied, "Good. I want the full map, not just the headline." That week, I withdrew from every non-essential aspect of my life. No calls. No dinners. No social obligations. I wasn't hiding. I was making space. Space for the truth to move through me without interruption. In the quiet, I began writing again. Not legal documents, letters. One to each family member. I wasn't planning to send them. Not yet. But writing helped me sort the pain from the facts. To my sister, I wrote, "I forgave you for not defending me the day Mom called me selfish in front of everyone. I never told you how much that cost me." To my brother, "I remember when you cried because Dad called you useless. I stood between you and his anger. You forgot that, didn't you?" To my mother, "You taught me how to make a home feel beautiful. You also taught me how to weaponize silence." I learned both lessons well. Each letter was stored in a folder labeled unsent. For now. It wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about building something solid in myself, something they hadn't already taken. Because even if I won the legal case, the emotional wreckage would remain. And I didn't want to stand in that wreckage holding a piece of paper and nothing else. So I kept anchoring myself. In my work. In long walks. In meals I actually sat down to eat. In real conversations with people who didn't want anything from me. People like Bernard, who checked in weekly now. And Helen, who had started calling just to see how I was sleeping. And Margie, who mailed me a Polaroid of the house from 2 years ago, when the magnolia tree was in bloom. She'd written in neat cursive on the back. "Roots remember. Even when people forget." That photo sat on my desk now. Right next to the court summons for the full evidentiary hearing. It was scheduled for 3 weeks out. I was ready. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt, still. Like the moment just before a wave hits. Not afraid. Not fragile. Just bracing for the moment the water crashes. And knowing, deep down, that I wouldn't drown in it this time. Some betrayals don't shout. They wait quietly until you're sitting face to face with the people who committed them, and realize they're still pretending it didn't happen. The courtroom wasn't grand. Just a small, sterile space with muted lighting and hardbacked chairs. But the silence was weightier than anything I'd felt in years. Even the air seemed to hum, charged by things left unsaid. I arrived early. Helen sat beside me, composed as ever. Her navy suit was sharp but understated, and her only visible accessory was a small lapel pin shaped like a scale. She didn't need flash. Her presence was its own defense. Opposite us, my mother walked in wearing cream, her favorite manipulation tactic. Clean, soft, maternal. She looked like a woman who hosted charity luncheons and volunteered on weekends. Not like someone who had sold her dead mother's house from under her daughter. My stepfather trailed behind, eyes scanning the room like he was checking for cameras. My brother wore a tie I'd given him years ago. He didn't look at me. My sister didn't show. Not at first. But 10 minutes before the hearing began, she slipped in through the side door and took a seat behind them, flanked by 2 of her friends. She didn't speak. Just watched me, blank and careful. It wasn't the courtroom that made my hands shake. It was that look. I knew it well, the performance of neutrality. The refusal to engage. The way someone shields their guilt by pretending not to feel anything at all. The judge was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and zero tolerance for posturing. Her presence steadied me. She didn't look like someone easily swayed by tears or dramatics. Helen opened cleanly. no embellishment. She presented the trust documents, the revoked power of attorney, the ledger entries from my grandmother, the financial tracing reports, and the ledger quote in her own handwriting, the one about home versus equity. Then she paused and handed the court the final exhibit. A color-printed spreadsheet. On it, every dollar from the house sale. Every transaction. Every false claim of medical debt, lined up against luxury payments, transfers to third-party consultants, and documented deposits into personal accounts. Helen didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Silence did the work for us. My mother's attorney cleared his throat, stood, and began speaking in the careful cadence of a man used to negotiating settlements over lunch. He emphasized family tension. Unresolved grief. He leaned on the word miscommunication as if it could erase signed checks and altered contracts. But when he got to the part about emotional stress, he pivoted. He said, "Ms. Emma Taylor has a history of anxiety and conflict avoidance. She struggled to maintain consistent family relationships. We believe her isolation from the rest of the family contributed to a misreading of intentions. There was no malicious action here, merely confusion about legal process." Helen cut in, sharp and professional. She said, "We're not here to litigate emotional closeness. We're here to address document fraud and financial misrepresentation. The defendant sold property she had no legal right to access. Confusion does not deposit funds into hidden accounts." The judge nodded. She looked at me. I stood slowly. This was the only time I would speak directly. I didn't read from a paper. I said, "I don't need them to like me. Or forgive me. Or remember birthdays. I just needed them to tell the truth." Then I sat back down. I didn't cry. My mother did. Not loud. Not messy. Just quiet sniffles behind a tissue she held too delicately, like she wanted the court to see how soft she could be. The judge asked 3 direct questions about the timeline of the house sale, the authority of the signatures, and the post-sale wire transfers. My mother deferred to her lawyer for all 3. The judge asked, "Did you receive financial benefit from the sale of 1842 Magnolia Drive?" My mother didn't answer immediately. Then finally, yes. That was all. But it was enough. The hearing ended. The decision would be issued in writing, 2 weeks. We stood, gathered our things. No one looked at me. As I turned to leave, I passed my sister in the back row. She still didn't speak. But her expression had shifted. Not guilt. Not sympathy. Just discomfort. And in some ways, that said more than an apology ever could. Outside the courthouse, the wind was colder than I expected. It cut through my coat and settled along my collarbone like a warning. I exhaled and kept walking. Helen caught up with me by the parking garage. She said, "You were clear. That matters." I replied, I wasn't aiming for clarity. I just didn't want to be invisible this time. She nodded, then said something I hadn't expected. "You're not." That night, I made dinner for myself. Real food. Not microwave meals or silent takeout. I lit a candle and sat at the table alone. Not in sadness. Not in victory. Just, in presence. And as I cleaned up, I noticed a voicemail waiting. It was from my brother. He said, "I didn't know what was happening. I didn't see it. I should have." The rest cut off. I didn't play it again. Instead, I poured a glass of water, returned to the kitchen table, and reopened the folder marked unsent. I pulled out the letter I had written to him and crossed out the last line. Then I rewrote it. Because something in me had shifted. Not toward reconciliation. But toward precision. And I knew what had to come next. Justice didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like a white envelope slid under my door, stamped with the seal of the county clerk's office. I stared at it for a long time before I opened it. Not out of fear, just the weight of finality. Some part of me still believed that closure would come with noise. But it didn't. It came on plain paper. The judgment was clear: the sale had been unlawful. My mother's authority had lapsed before the transaction was processed. The court recognized the misuse of funds and granted a full reversal of title. The property was to be returned under my name. But it didn't stop there. They were ordered to pay restitution, not just the sale profits, but the damages tied to misrepresentation and legal fees. The number at the bottom was larger than I expected. Large enough to sting. Not large enough to destroy. I held the paper in my hands and waited to feel triumphant. Instead, I just felt still. Helen called 2 hours later. Her voice was steady, professional. She said, "You did it." I replied, "No. We just made it visible." Because that's what this was. Not revenge. Not punishment. Visibility. For every quiet daughter who was told she was imagining things. For every woman labeled difficult for asking questions that made others squirm. For every time I swallowed my instincts because someone older said, "Let it go." I wasn't letting it go anymore. The fallout started quietly. My mother didn't call. She didn't write. But word traveled. First through neighbors, little things. Her absence from church committees. Rumors about the lawyer fees. A story about her trying to sell another property and the deal falling through after the buyer did some digging. Then came the emails. From people I hadn't spoken to in years. A second cousin apologizing for the assumptions he'd made. A neighbor from Magnolia Drive thanking me for standing up for the integrity of the place. Even a message from my high school English teacher, saying she'd heard and that she wasn't surprised, that I had always been the quiet kind of brave. I didn't respond to most of them. Not out of rudeness. I just didn't need applause. What I needed was my own breath back. I visited the house the next morning. Alone. It looked the same on the outside: white shutters, the magnolia tree leaning a little too far over the porch now. But the energy had changed. It no longer felt haunted by betrayal. Just paused. Like it had been holding its breath, waiting for the right person to come home. I unlocked the door. Walked from room to room, slowly, letting the silence greet me like an old friend. The air still smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust. The floorboards remembered the way I used to tiptoe across them at night, trying not to wake my grandmother. In the hallway, a picture had fallen behind the radiator. I pulled it out gently. It was us, me and her, sitting on the front steps, holding iced tea in mason jars. I was 16. She had her arm around my shoulder. On the back, in her handwriting. "Keep this house close. It remembers you." I put it back on the wall. No dramatic music. No cinematic lighting. Just quiet acknowledgement. The next day, I had the locks changed. Not out of fear. Just out of completion. Then I made a decision. I wasn't going to move in. Not right now. Instead, I turned the house into a long-term sanctuary lease for women transitioning out of domestic situations. It was something my grandmother had always talked about, a dream she never had the time or resources to realize. Now, I did. I partnered with a local nonprofit. Met with case managers. Walked them through every room. They were stunned by the offer. One of them said, "You could rent this for triple what we can pay." I replied, "This place owes the world something better than profit." Within 2 weeks, the first resident moved in. Her name was Lena. She was 27 and quiet, like me. She didn't ask questions when I handed her the keys. She just looked around and whispered, "I've never had my own room before." I left a letter for her in the nightstand. Just 2 lines. "You are safe here. This house remembers what healing sounds like." In the weeks that followed, life settled. Helen wrapped up the final filings. My stepfather declared bankruptcy. My mother made no public statement, but withdrew from every social group she once led. My brother tried to reach out again. I let his message sit unread. I wasn't ready. Maybe one day. But not now. My sister never said anything. Not a text. Not a call. Just a photo posted on her profile, her holding a bouquet at someone else's wedding. The caption said, "Family is everything." I didn't react. I just closed the app. Because not everything requires a response. Some things only need a boundary. And I was finally learning how to build them. The old kind of me, the appeaser, the silent one, would have tried to explain herself, to mend, to fix. But the woman I was now understood that healing doesn't always include reconciliation. Sometimes, healing just means walking away without looking back. Sometimes, it means standing alone, without bitterness, without apology, just peace. That night, I sat on the porch swing of the house one last time before handing it over fully to the nonprofit. The wind moved through the magnolia leaves like a lullaby. And somewhere inside me, something loosened. I didn't cry. But I did close my eyes and say, quietly, I kept my promise. The house didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like understanding. And I knew, it was time to go home. Grief doesn't end when you win. It just stops needing to be explained. After everything, my life didn't change in any flashy way. I still woke up early. Still made coffee. Still went to work and answered emails and folded laundry. The difference was internal, a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Like a table finally set on level ground. The house became what it was always meant to be, a place of restoration. Not just for the women who passed through its doors now, but for me, too. I visited once a month, quietly, just to make sure the plumbing worked, the paint wasn't peeling, the garden stayed alive. Each time, it felt less like mine. And that was a good thing. Because it had become something bigger than ownership. It was legacy. Not in the financial sense. In the quiet sense. The way a memory becomes shelter. The nonprofit invited me to a community event they were holding on the front lawn. I went. Not as the benefactor, not as the woman who'd fought a lawsuit, just as Emma. I sat under the shade of the magnolia tree with a paper cup of lemonade and listened to laughter from people I'd never met. That's when it hit me, this was what healing sounds like. Not silence. Not apologies. But unburdened joy. Later that evening, I walked back through the house one last time. The wallpaper had changed. The furniture, too. But the bones were the same. And standing in the doorway of my grandmother's old bedroom, I felt something I hadn't expected. Permission. Not from her. From myself. To leave. To release. To stop defining myself by what I'd had to protect. Because the truth is, quiet revenge isn't about taking something back. It's about proving, to yourself, that you never needed their permission to be right. After that night, I stopped checking their profiles. I didn't answer when my brother reached out again. I didn't correct the narratives they tried to spin. I let them say what they needed to say, to themselves, to others. Because I no longer lived in the version of me they needed to defeat. I lived somewhere else now. In a life that felt mine. I started seeing someone. His name was Matthew. We met at a bookstore, both reaching for the same copy of a travel essay collection. He asked me what I liked to read. I told him, anything with truth in it. He smiled. We went slow. Deliberate. He didn't flinch when I told him about the court case. He didn't try to rescue me, didn't offer judgment. Just asked questions. Listened. One night, he said, "What do you want now?" Not 5 years from now. Right now. I thought about it. Then I replied, peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's behavior. And for the first time, I believed I was building exactly that. I still think about my grandmother. Not with pain anymore. With gratitude. She never tried to save me from the truth. She just gave me the tools to survive it. A deed. A journal. A magnolia tree. And the kind of love that leaves a key hidden in the obvious place, trusting you'll find it when the time is right. I visit her grave sometimes. I don't bring flowers. I just sit. Let the wind do what it does best, carry things away. One afternoon, I brought Matthew with me. He stood quietly, a respectful distance away, while I sat on the bench beside the headstone. When I stood up, he asked, "Did she know how much she meant to you?" I answered, "Yes." I told her. Not in words, maybe. But she knew. We walked back in silence. Not the awkward kind. The sacred kind. Now, when people ask me why I don't talk to my family, I don't explain. I just say, we remember things differently. That's enough. Closure isn't an event. It's a series of small decisions. To protect your own peace. To build a life where you no longer have to rehearse your pain just to be understood. To stop bleeding for people who call it love when they watch you bleed. I still keep the binder of documents. Not as a trophy. Just as proof that truth can survive distortion if you stay with it long enough. That silence can be a strategy. That the most radical thing a woman can do sometimes is not flinch. And now, when I drive past the old neighborhood, I don't feel tension in my chest anymore. Just breath. Just distance. Just the soft, certain knowing that I left exactly when I was supposed to. Some things aren't meant to be salvaged. Some stories aren't meant to be retold. But this one? This one, I lived. And I lived it with both eyes open.